Hello, everybody. So this is Liam Coughlin, and I'm here doing a deck tech with this Adam Price Black-White Pestilence brew. So I wrote an article earlier this week. You'll probably have read it. It will have come out on Tuesday. This video probably won't come up till at least Wednesday, possibly even Thursday. Unclear. But at any rate, in my article, I talked about the Monday metagame. I'm going to be doing this on a weekly basis. Um, and in that, I named my spiciest deck of the week, the thing that I thought was the sweetest. And for this week, that was this Black White Pestilence deck. And so upon reading the initial responses, tons of people wanted to see this deck, see the list. So I'm going to post a copy of the list below, and then I'm also doing this deck tech so that you guys can get a better idea of how the deck works. So what does this deck really aim to do? Adam and I had a sort of brief conversation about this, and I'm going to try and describe it as best as possible in his words. But basically, what this deck is trying to do is make really efficient value plays, and then eventually kill your opponent somehow. And so when I'm talking about value plays, we're talking about like trying to acquire like 2-for-1s, or in a lot of cases actually just 1-for-1ing really aggressively. You'll notice this deck has like a ton of 1-for-1 spells. We have these 1-for-1 removal spells, Banishing Light, Oblivion Ring as well. Tons of 1-for-1 hand attack spells like Thoughtseize, Inquisition of Kozilek, Duress. And then after we've done all this 1-for-1ing, we're going to eventually get ahead by acquiring like a couple of 2-for-1s. So we have this like Hymn to Turok is just an obvious 2-for-1. We have Sign in Blood and Night's Whisper, which are always going to be a 2-for-1. And then going even more over the top, we have our X-for-1 spells, our spells that generate potentially boundless amounts of value. So we have cards like Mind Twist, Mutilate, Toxic Deluge, and Damnation. These are all sort of very good examples of X-for-1 spells, where Mind Twist potentially gets 5 cards for the cost of one of ours. Liliana of the Veil also potentially breaks parity, because if we're spending our entire game empty-handed, because we're just playing everything we draw, Liliana potentially just eats our opponent's draw step every turn. So we're trying to trade cards, play our 1-for-1, our X-for-1 removal, and then eventually draw more cards with effects like Phyrexian Arena. And then eventually, as I said, we're going to try and kill them with a threat. So we have these reasonable threats. We have Phyrexian Obliterator, Wormcoil Engine, Steel Hellkite, Demigod of Revenge, Desecration Demon, Grave Titan. All of these threats are pretty large, which is very important, and perhaps most importantly, they're pretty hard to deal with. So you'll notice that like Phyrexian Obliterator, you can't actually interact with that in combat. It just won't work. You're going to be so far out of the game if you ever deal combat damage to it that it's not going to put you in a winning situation. Same thing with Wormcoil Engine. It's pretty difficult to deal with this card without some kind of exile effect, and those are pretty few and far between. Similarly, we have threats like Pack Rat, which are very durable and oftentimes can win the game on their own. And we have threats like Grave Titan and Massacre Worm, which either generate a lot of value when they enter the battlefield, or in the case of Grave Titan, leave value behind even after they die. So these kinds of threats are really what we're trying to kill our opponents with. And then on our way to these larger threats, we're also playing a bunch of more disruptive, smaller threats. So like Nightveil Spectre, Hypnotic Spectre, Mesmeric Fiend, all of these are great examples. Vampire Nighthawk as well. These are all great examples of threats that are pretty unlikely to win the game just entirely on their own, though Adam has beaten me with just a Hypnotic Spectre before. My combo deck did not like that very much. These threats are unlikely to win the game completely on their own. However, they're going to help you get there. They're going to generate some amount of value. And in a lot of cases, they demand an answer immediately, which I think is pretty important for this deck. The other aspect of this deck that is, I think, a little more subtle and understated is that we really are actually kind of aggressively ramping into these threats. So, like, Adam's playing cards like Cabal Coffers and Lake of the Dead for purposes of getting these threats out super, super quickly. We're also playing like Coalition Relic, Mind Stone, a couple Moxins and Soul Ring, and even an Orzhov Signet, all to get these reasonable threats out faster. So let's talk about what the points are in this deck. It seems like a reasonable time to segue into that. So we've got Soul Ring, Moxjet, and then Demonic Tutor is the last set of points. So Soul Ring and Moxjet are doing exactly what I talked about. When we're trying to value our opponent out of the game, we're playing all these reasonable value cards. Playing them faster is just almost always going to be better. And then Demonic Tutor is really interesting in this deck. This is like potentially the most fair use of Demonic Tutor you can possibly imagine, right? We're like Demonic Tutoring for our Liliana of the Veil to lock our combo opponent out of the game. We're like Demonic Tutoring for Phyrexian Arena against our control opponent so that we just like have a constant source of cards. I think the potentially the funniest use of Demonic Tutor is, Demonic Tutor for Crypt Rats so that we can burn our opponent out. But these are all plays that this deck realistically wants to make. So I really like Demonic Tutor in this deck. I don't think I would play anything else. It's kind of funny because it's not exactly what one would think of as a conventional use of Demonic Tutor. So talking to Adam, the best non-points cards that he thinks are in the deck are Dark Ritual, and this again kind of goes into the ramp theme, trying to play things as quickly as possible. Adam has said that he will not mulligan a hand with 2 lands and a Hymn to Turok. He just can't bring himself to do it. And really, like, Swamp Hymn to Turok really does sort of like epitomize what this deck is trying to do, right? It's like play a couple lands, 2 for 1 you, play a threat, kill you. The other 2 cards that he really likes in this deck are Abyssal Persecutor. Thinks it's one of the best cards. I think this card's amazing. Part of the reason why I like the deck so much is because of Abyssal Persecutor's presence and effectiveness in the deck. And then Adam has actually said that he thinks that Crypt Rats is actually just the best card in the deck. He said that he's won a ton of games just by popping these guys for a large number and killing his opponent, which is super fascinating. And I'm totally inclined to believe him. It's super interesting. But Crypt Rats again are an insane source of value in this deck and really do serve a whole bunch of different roles. So let's talk about the matchups for this deck and what its good matchups are and what its bad matchups are. So this deck loves playing against creature decks, particularly like aggressive creature decks that are trying to commit a lot, that have to commit a lot to the board in order to be able to be successful. This deck really, really preys upon. So, your white weenie aggressive decks, your mono red decks, your, Naya or Jund aggressive decks are all pretty favorable matchups for this kind of deck, where we get to use our effects like Withering Wisps and Crypt Rats to sort of full effect. Similarly, even the aggressive decks that are more blue based, the sort of tempo decks, those can still be fairly reasonable matchups as well. For one thing, a lot of your value plays just end up being like pretty good against those tempo decks, which are working so hard to establish a threat that they can oftentimes fall behind playing things like Daze and Force of Will, where they're actually 2 for 1ing themselves in order to just kind of try and keep that one threat. And in this deck, we have such a high density of removal that the potential to remove their threat and really keep them from killing us is high enough that we usually can get to our end game where we're playing some huge threat that they just can't deal with after they've run out of counter spells. So those are the good matchups. Matchups where creatures are really important and where our opponent is relying on having creatures on the board to win the game. Those matchups are great. Adam was saying that the matchups he does not want to play against, that he really doesn't like, are the control and combo matchups. And I think that there's like a slight caveat that there are some kinds of combo decks that this deck is actually fairly reasonable against. So like, for instance, the mono green combo deck, which was actually fairly present on Monday. There were a whole 3 copies of mono green combo decks. This deck still has a very fine matchup against that deck because it is so creature based. But against combo decks that are not as creature based, so against the Tolarian Academy decks, this deck has a pretty hard time against those. It really struggles to remove artifacts. You'll notice we only have sort of, I think, 3 ways of interacting with artifacts. So beyond that, we're basically dead to rights to some different kinds of artifacts. And also, Adam said that he doesn't really like playing against control decks. His one loss on Monday actually came to Will Fairbrother, who was on Grixis control as usual. And I'm saying that when your opponent's curve is Signet, card draw spell, Planeswalker, that's pretty hard to beat as this deck, right? Like, we have a hard time dealing with Planeswalkers. We have a reasonably hard time dealing with our opponents playing like a large bulk of spells also designed to gain value. So that matchup, the blue based control decks can also be a reasonably difficult matchups. There are obviously draws that we have which like beat them. You know, for instance, if we get to Ritual into Mind Twist on turn one, like we're probably in pretty decent shape. And Hymn to Turok and Duress and other cards like that go a long way in those matchups as well. But we really are sort of sometimes lacking the tools to go long with those decks that are also designed to go long. The matchup that I wonder about, and I actually didn't get a chance to talk to Adam about this, is against the creature decks that are also designed to be value decks. So like the Junk and Jund decks that are really trying to go is in a super value based direction. So Alistair Howie's Green Black Rock deck, for instance, I do wonder what that matchup is like, because I think that both decks are trying to do approximately the same thing. Um, and so I wonder whether being basically mono black helps at all in that matchup with consistency. I imagine it might, but I do think that that matchup might end up being reasonably draw dependent. Um, so like that's a bit of a tough one. And then yeah, Adam said that the combo decks are pretty rough. I mean, like unless they're combo decks that are super dependent on creatures, you really do struggle, right? Like we can interact with Mind Twist and Duress and Thoughtseize and this kind of thing, but we have a bit of a hard time putting on a really considerable clock. And there are potential draws that you get where your hand is just full of ramp spells and ways to interact with your opponent's creatures, and they just don't have any. So that could be quite hard. Although right now there's hardly any storm in the room or anything of that variety. You know, no high tide or anything either. So you know that matchup pretty pretty safe to say it's not going to come up all that often. So let's talk about why I picked this deck as the spiciest deck of the week and why I liked it so much. So one reason is that obviously this week was dominated by creature decks. Tons and tons and tons of decks playing creatures in the metagame on Monday, and as a result, you know, the Withering Wisp Crypt Rats deck is in a great shape. Great shape. Really wants to play against those decks. So I thought that it was a reasonably good metagame call, though I'm not sure Adam uh, you know plays the metagame so much that he in a way in which he's like trying to metagame against exactly the field every single week, but I do think he was aware that there are a reasonable number of creature decks present. The other reason I picked this deck is just that it's like really clearly a labor of love of someone who loves black mana symbols, and I just thought it would be fun to feature a deck which is so obviously, you know, been carefully thought of and really demonstrates someone's affinity for maybe one particular style of deck, right? Like Adam has made some choices which I think are indicative of the fact that he's played this style of deck before and a lot. So like a couple of cards in here that you probably wouldn't immediately want to throw in a deck like this are like Army of the Damned. This seems like an effect which is just way too expensive to play in Highlander, but we've got, you know, Cryptghast and Cabal Coffers and Lake of the Dead to help support this. And against a lot of decks, I don't actually know how you beat this deck, beat this card. Like if you don't have a Wrath and you don't have, and you're not killing your opponent immediately after they play it, then I'm not sure how that happens. So I think that there are card choices like Army of the Damned, you know, Abyssal Persecutor, Demigod of Revenge that really demonstrate an awareness and knowledge, and I think that's super sweet. So I wanted to feature that deck for this reason. So that's pretty much it, guys. If you want to leave some comments below or get in contact with me, I'm always around in Victoria. So you can find me there. You can find me on the Canadian Highlander blog. I'm posting there pretty consistently now. So if you have any comments, please get back at me. I hope this was informative and that you enjoyed it. And we're looking to do this a little more often. I'm going to try and increase the amount of coverage that we're doing of the Highlander format. So expect a deck tech like this about once a week, hopefully. So with that, I'll see you guys later and have a good one.